Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. If you're watching this right now, you most likely are trapped at home unless you're one of the courageous essential workers who are still running around out there keeping society running. This also means a lot of people are stuck at home and for the first time in a long time struggling to find things to do. At least two of my friends, without consulting each other, have bought high-end gaming PCs so that they can catch up to all the games they've missed out over the years. Some of us are lucky enough to have VR systems, and right as the quarantine hits us in real life, Half Life Alyx hits us with the quarantine in the digital world. So I just finished Half Life Alyx, and it's one of the best games I've ever played. It's definitely going to be in the running for best game of the year, and it's probably the best VR game that's ever been made. But today I want to talk to you guys about the maturity of this technology, what kind of game library you can expect and experience you can expect when you buy your first VR system. This is a video for those of you who aren't very familiar with VR and are kind of on the fence on whether you want to invest in this technology or not, because right now I'm sure a lot of people are stuck at home and they're thinking about the possibility of getting a system like this. While VR systems might seem like another type of interface for a computer like a gaming wheel or a flight simulator stick, you should really think about them more like an individual console. This is the one I have. It's called an Oculus Rift S. At around $400, it's on the cheaper end of headsets. Valve, the creators of Half-Life, have their own system, the Index, which costs around $1,000. That includes a headset, controller, and 2 tracking stations. The other big names right now would be the HTC Vive Cosmos, and then PlayStation has their own independent VR system as well, and a separate game library. Now, for those of you who aren't playing on the PlayStation VR, you most likely will need to invest in a high-end PC system to be able to enjoy VR. The Oculus Rift S recommends that you have at least last generation NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 video card. So you're most likely going to have to spend at least an additional $500 or so for a desktop capable of running VR. And that's the bare minimum when you're shopping for our VR desktop, because it's very important to make sure you can maintain high enough frame rates. Otherwise, you're going to be very, very uncomfortable with choppy and jagged looking footage. I personally would recommend a PC with at least 16 gigabytes of RAM and an RTX 260 gaming card, especially for those of you who get really motion sick. So no matter how you look at it, if you're getting into VR, you're probably going to be spending on average $1,000 to get a stable and decent setup, making it far more expensive than any console system that I can think of. So what is your first experience on VR going to be like? Well, if it's a game like Half Life Alyx, which has beautiful artwork and large city vistas, you'll probably just stand there awestruck and take in everything for a moment. What happens next will heavily depend on your body's tolerance for motion sickness and just how high-end your computer is. You'll want your system to aim for 90 frames per second. Anything lower than 40 frames a second makes the screen a bit choppy and very uncomfortable for me. I do get motion sickness occasionally, but only in extreme situations like being stuck on a tiny boat in the middle of the ocean. If you can pass the motion sickness hurdle, you'll most likely have a pretty good time. Most people are going to be in between somewhere where they will get sick if they play certain types of games or if they play too long. You can build a tolerance, though, to how sick you get when you play these games. It's something you can actually work on. If you do manage to master your motion sickness, you'll see that VR technology is pretty awesome, but it's also pretty unfinished and a bit janky. And I'm not just talking about the game designs. The actual setup of the hardware and connecting everything is definitely a bit cumbersome, and there's a lot of bugs and issues that you'll have to deal with. This is partly because VR as a gaming format is still in its first few generations. It's still kind of not figured out yet. Another thing that might be disappointing is you'll notice that the resolution in the headsets aren't that great, and there's a limited field of view. All the headsets that I mentioned have higher than HD resolution video projected to each eye, but it doesn't really feel enough because the screen is literally a few inches from your eyes. Sometimes you'll get what's known as the screen door effect, which is when you can actually see sort of a mesh develop that shows the gap in between pixels. Now, the field of view for most of the headsets I talk about range from around 100 degrees to around 130, which is actually pretty good. That's a lot more than most night vision goggles actually have. And you get used to that limited field of view pretty quickly. You don't really get tunnel vision because your eyes basically only focus on the center of the screen anyway. So It's not too bad. Now, enough about the hardware and the setup. If you can get past the technical and financial hurdles of buying and setting up the system, now we have to look at the games available. The software library for VR is growing every day, and the quality of the games are definitely increasing. But the majority of the games on the Steam VR library or the Oculus library are all kind of limited and basic at this point. Most VR exclusive games out there are kind of gimmicky right now. There are plenty of games that essentially focus on one cool gameplay mechanic that is unique to VR, like for instance shooting a bow, or sword fighting, or shooting a gun. These are amazing experiences, of course, for first-timers. But once you get used to these mechanics, the amazement kind of wears off, and you'll start to notice that most of these games are nothing more than a glorified tech demo. Gameplay and visuals check, a story and pretty much everything else is missing. One of the biggest problems that the VR industry is now facing is that it just has a limited audience, and that's because it's a relatively new system and it's also pretty expensive to get involved. And that's because as important as cutting-edge graphics and immersion is and having a good gameplay library is, accessibility is equally as important, especially for the developers. There are an estimated 2.2 billion PC gamers in the world, and probably even more mobile gamers. If you're gonna build an awesome game that requires a large amount of investment and a huge amount of staff, you're gonna wanna make sure that that game can reach the widest audience possible so you can at least recoup all the money that you just spent making that game. We've had AAA games ported to VR like Skyrim and Fallout 4, but to be honest, they're complete garbage trash can fires. When you play VR, gameplay mechanics and control schemes are extremely important. And when a game is not built up for VR, you can feel it and it's immersion shattering and generally very clunky. A good VR game requires a lot of real-time physics and interactions with the world around you. And while graphics and art design are not the most important thing when it comes to general video gaming, in VR gaming it's definitely heavily weighted. And that's because this system is all about immersion, which comes from the combination of audio cues, visual cues, and how you interact with things. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have games like Pavlov. Pavlov has terrific controls, and it's basically like Counter-Strike in VR, but the game has very little developer content, and most of the maps are user-created. Don't get me wrong, I love Pavlov, and I've spent countless hours online playing the variety of user-generated content, but it's definitely different from a tailor-made gaming experience that might come from a AAA budget studio. So when Valve announced that they were going to release Half Life Alyx on VR exclusively, it was pretty shocking for the gaming industry. Valve was releasing the first Half-Life game in over a decade, and it wasn't going to be on any other system but VR, bypassing the lucrative console and PC market for a relatively small VR audience. Now, a lot of you will point out that Valve probably wanted to sell headsets, and they did. You can't really get an index right now, they're completely sold out. But Half Life Alyx was not just some kind of gimmicky game made to sell consoles. It's a true, fully fleshed out Half-Life experience. And the difference of having a AAA developer behind a VR game is immediately felt. In this vacuum of high-end content, Valve's art direction and visuals and focus on the details are breathtaking. And for any of you who have played the Half-Life series, you know its world is pretty dreary and dark. Yet whether it was walking through a tunnel full of alien spores or slowly wading through a flooded basement, Alyx looked beautiful and so atmospheric at every moment. And when you encounter your first NPCs, you can't help but marvel at how good the character models look and are animated. Now granted, you're currently watching all of this footage on a 2D screen, and compared to other PC games, it might not look all that special. As a matter of fact, the visuals and setting might even remind you of the Metro series, which actually was inspired by Half-Life in the first place. But in virtual reality, and this is coming from someone who's played a lot of terrible virtual reality games, Half-Life Alyx has changed the game and set a new level for visual fidelity, and that's a great thing, because with every layer of realism you add to this format, you get another layer of immersion. Which also makes Half-Life Alyx one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had gaming. But it wasn't just the sense of dread and depression you get with old Silent Hill games, it's more of a present, exciting, adrenaline-fueled fear that makes you want to push to the next area. Valve does a great job cramming you into dark abandoned buildings, and then just before you're about to run out of hope and ammo, you open up a door and suddenly you're standing on the rooftop of a building soaking in a sunset while looking at the beautiful city of 17. It's moments like this that help create a sense of connection to the gaming world that very few other gaming formats can replicate. It's something that only VR can do, and it's probably the greatest gift and potential it can give to us now that we're all stuck at home. You can literally visit other places. Valve is also the creator of the mind-bending Portal series, and they continue their tradition of creating intricate physics-based puzzles in this game. I typically hate puzzles in games. They are immersion-breaking and ruin the pacing. But because of the format and controls, all the puzzles in Alyx are much more natural and realistic and seamless, and therefore enjoyable. The game isn't perfect though. The combat and controls for the gun mechanics are a bit clunky. Other games like Pavlov have done it better in my opinion. And the world also lacks the same level of interaction and physics when compared to games like Boneworks, which is actually inspired by Half-Life as well. But Half Life Alyx is close to being perfect and will be an important part of gaming history, either as the game that took VR mainstream or as the game that couldn't take VR mainstream. And that's basically where we're at right now. Either Half Life Alyx can be a one-off thing. I mean, Valve is a privately traded company, and a privately traded company can take bigger risks like introducing new hardware and then creating a game specifically to sell that hardware. It's not something that everyone would do. And right now, unfortunately, most of the major developers in the gaming industries are so profit and data driven, they might never take VR seriously and will wait until the audience grows large enough or the technology matures more. Even if the VR gaming industry does grow, they still might not create VR specific games because they're pretty hard to port to consoles and PC and vice versa. Or Half Life Alyx will be the first of many Valve VR games, and other industry-leading developers will also come along as well and start developing exclusive content for this platform. VR will no longer be recognized as a technology that is in development, but as a stable piece of hardware that large amounts of money can be invested in. I personally don't really know where VR is heading. In its current state, it still feels a bit unfinished and somewhat raw, but no other gaming system has shown more potential and a higher ceiling than VR. One can only hope that enough people will continue investing in VR so that it can reach its full potential. So there you have it, guys. Those are my thoughts on the state of the VR industry and also the impact that Half-Life Alyx will have on the VR industry. I don't really like doing reviews because I think most reviews are kind of stupid. If you don't know the reviewer and what kind of games they like to play, what kind of movies they watch, it's kind of pointless because it's hard to kind of be completely objective when you give those reviews. So, you know, for me, obviously, I love immersion storytelling when it comes to games. So that's the kind of gamer I am, and this is why VR is kind of a perfect platform for me. But let me know in the comment section below if you have any other questions about VR or this game. Maybe I can answer and help you decide if you want to go this route when it comes to gaming. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.